The biggest downside to beginning my coverage of Byzantine history in 395 is that it requires me to cover the reign of the Emperor Arcadius. Now, Arcadius's reign itself is fascinating. There are a lot of huge figures during this time, and there are a lot of very important events which take place. The problem is, Arcadius, the man himself, is quite possibly the most boring man to ever walk the face of the earth, despite the fact that he actually lived in some fascinating times. In fact, the 5th century CE is probably about my third or fourth favorite historical period, and I still can't muster up much enthusiasm for talking about Arcadius himself. So that part of the video is going to be pretty short, but we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the other figures and the politics of this pivotal moment in Roman history. Let's get started. We don't really have a description of Arcadius' personality, but we do get some descriptions of his physical appearance. We know that he was of short stature, he had a dark complexion, he was thin, and he doesn't seem to have been someone who had a lot of energy. According to some accounts, this is based on a fairly old-fashioned book by J.B. Bury that I consulted for this video, he had a manner of speech which betrayed a dullness of wit. I just love the way that was phrased, so I put it in this video. He also apparently had sleepy, droopy eyes. I'm not sure if that's from someone studying this statue, this bust of him over here, or whether that was from a written description somewhere else. He also was known for not appearing very often in public. Not only was he a palace emperor, the first of his kind really, but he also was a palace emperor among palace emperors. Now, most palace emperors will go out in the streets sometimes and wave or attend races or whatever, but Arcadius is a guy you would maybe see a few times a year if you're on the lookout and you're, one of those imperial obsessed citizens who really wants to see a member of the imperial family. We also know that he was in pretty consistent poor health throughout his life. At the time of his accession, he was already a grown man, albeit a very young one. He was 17 or 18 years old, and as such, you would expect that he would have the strength of character to rule the empire in his own name. Now, certainly he did technically rule the empire in his own name, and there was no regent in place, but for all practical intents and purposes, other people who have access to him did all the work, made all the decisions, and he would simply sign off on their work. When they were replaced with others, he would simply go along with those people. And he mostly does not seem to have been the guy who was responsible for making the substitutions of his chief advisors. We also know one thing about him, his favorite vacation spot. He liked to spend his summers at the modern city of Ankara, which in antiquity was called Ancyra. So now let's talk about people who are actually interesting. When Theodosius died in 395, he had just recently reunified the empire after fighting a civil war against Eugenius in Italy. This meant that this was a time where there was still some tension and there were still some challenges. And upon his death, he had two sons, Arcadius and Honorius. Now, Arcadius, we've already talked about, you know what his problems were, but Honorius was 12 years old. So this meant that you needed strong supervision in both the East and the West to make sure that the empire continued functioning at a relatively high level. So Theodosius left his most capable functionary, Flavius Stilicho, in the West as the supervisor and aide for Honorius. Now, Stilicho was a very ambitious and capable man. He was an important general who had helped Theodosius immensely during his last years, and he also was someone with a great deal of ambition and someone with a lot of energy. So basically, from what we can tell, Stilicho was the biggest mover and shaker during the time of Arcadius. So no other Roman had his level of influence or power during this period. And because the West at this time was already a bit of a backwater, 3/4 of the empire's population and wealth were in the East, Stilicho wanted to reunite the empire under his own control. Most likely he was maybe looking to set up Honorius as the puppet emperor of the whole empire, and then through marriage alliances with Honorius have one of his sons or grandsons eventually rise to the purple. But we don't really know if that is an actual plan that Stilicho had formulated, or whether this was just a historical tradition written about him later. But at any rate, it's clear that Stilicho was a schemer of the highest order, and that he would interfere in the East many, many times over the next several years. And in the East, the man who was the primary assistant to Arcadius early in his reign was Flavius Rufinus. He is the Praetorian Prefect of the East, which basically means that he's the guy running the government, sort of like the Grand Vizier or Prime Minister or something of that nature. Now, in some ways, Rufinus kind of looks like the Stilicho of the East. He's tall and active and vigorous, and he's someone who, looks like he can get stuff done. He's also originally from Gaul, and now that he is in Constantinople, he's in a city where most people speak Greek, and he's still struggling to master that language. He would have grown up speaking Latin, so now he is trying to learn Greek, and his Greek is a little goofy. Now, Rufinus was also pretty ambitious, and he wanted to establish his own power more firmly, so he started to cause the downfall of officials who might oppose him. And just like Stilicho, but with a lot less subtlety, he was scheming to become a co-emperor. And one of the things he did was have Arcadius marry his daughter. But, of course, this rouses resentment. And as I said, while he might resemble Stilicho on paper, he's not nearly as capable as a politician as Stilicho. One of the major disadvantages for Rufinus as someone who was trying to control the Emperor Arcadius is that there were other people working behind the scenes who also had an interest in being the puppet master, and one of them was named Eutropius. He was a eunuch chamberlain who decided to destroy Rufinus's marriage scheme by finding a beautiful young woman for Arcadius to marry. This young woman was named Aelia Eudoxia, and she is one of the most famous of all of the women of the Theodosian dynasty. And to make things even more fun, she actually happened to be the daughter of one of Rufinus's victims. So she would be very influential for Arcadius, who after all was 17 or 18, and now he's got this beautiful young woman who's his wife, and she doesn't like Rufinus. So that might rub off on Arcadius if he could be bothered to act. So if Aelia Eudoxia decides that she wants to side with ministers who want to poach Rufinus, then she can probably coax her husband into supporting her ideas. That means Eutropius has now secured himself a very well-placed ally who will have influence on Arcadius. The two of them are married in April of 395, and for a while it'll look like Rufinus is still in charge, even if this was a fairly major setback to his plans. By the way, this bust of someone named Eutropius is probably not the eunuch Eutropius, it's probably someone else, but at any rate, that person is named Eutropius, so close enough. In 395, the first year of Arcadius' reign, he faced his first challenge when King Alaric the Visigoth revolted and invaded Greece. This resulted in the sack of Athens that same year. This is one of many pictures that artists have made of that event, where Alaric entered Athens in triumph. And actually, it seems like there are more pictures of Alaric sacking Athens than there are of him sacking Rome, which I've never quite understood since, the sack of Rome in 410 is such a iconic event, Anyway, whatever. So the Eastern armies at this time are not really able to respond because they're occupied with other stuff. So Stilicho, who's always looking to extend a tentacle into the East, marches in and contacts the Eastern government as he is beating up on Alaric. So Stilicho is winning battles and has Alaric on the ropes, but then Arcadius and the Eastern government issues a strong warning for him to leave. They order him out. So Stilicho retreats rather than risking a civil war, and then they do something really stupid by making an agreement with Alaric, which did not cripple him, but we'll get to that in due time. And part of the tension between Stilicho and the Eastern government is that the two sides were quarreling over ownership of Illyricum, that sort of chunk of land in the northwest of the Balkans, which connects Italy with Eastern Europe. And that land is contested not only because of its position, but because it fielded a lot of soldiers. It's this rough mountainous area where a lot of people want to, grow up to become soldiers. And the conflict is because this area had been part of the West prior to 379, but when Gratian had restored the East, he had given it to Theodosius, the Eastern Emperor, in order to allow for the East to have an area to produce revenue and troops to help them, get the Gothic problem in hand. But now Stilicho is saying he wants it back, and predictably, the government of Arcadius is saying, nah. As I mentioned earlier, shortly before he died, Theodosius had led his army from the east and reconquered the west by taking out his rival Eugenius in Italy, and his troops hadn't yet returned to the east. So part of Stilicho's mission, at least as he saw it, was to return those troops to their station and also beat Alaric while he was doing it. So when Stilicho decided to head back west after being warned off by the eastern government, he left these troops in the east. And they're now under a general named Gainas. So Gainas is not a big fan of Rufinus, apparently, for reasons we don't really know. So when Gainas met with Rufinus, Rufinus rode out of Constantinople and joined Gainas and his men. Rufinus was surrounded and killed. Now, the sources, because they know that Stilicho was a plotter, all blame Stilicho for this assassination, but it easily as well could have been Gainas, because he also benefited quite a bit from this event, as we'll see. And the death of Rufinus now means that Eutropius is the chief advisor to Arcadius, and he now has influence through the Empress, and he does not have a strong Praetorian prefect in his way. So right now, Eutropius is effectively ruling the East, a eunuch. Unfortunately for the Eastern Empire, Eutropius was far better at plotting to seize power than actually using power to govern. So he was deeply corrupt financially. And I will caution before we go any further that this was a sort of trope that people made about eunuchs, that they were financially corrupt. Obviously, they couldn't be sexually corrupt because they would have had very limited sex drive since they never hit puberty. But the idea current in the literature the time was that because they didn't have the sexual drive, they were overwhelmed by this drive to acquire wealth. So we see this in this account of Eutropius. So he not only sells off offices, but he also sacks two generals, puts them up on charges which are clearly false, and confiscates their wealth. So he's making enemies at a pretty rapid rate at this point. And at the same time, the Eastern Army is continuing to become more and more dominated by Germanic troops, which means that the army is becoming more and more likely to support its generals, who oftentimes are people from their ethnic group and people to whom they owe other obligations which go beyond their duties as hired Roman soldiers. So not only is Eutropius doing bad things in government, but he's also setting up future bad things to happen from the government that his successors might not be able to control. So the effective result of Stilicho leaving the east and going back west was that the army was left without a competent leader who was determined to deal with Alaric and the Visigothic threat. So Alaric has been running amok for the last 2 years. It's now the year 397. And Stilicho decides to sail east and deal with this problem. But once again, the Eastern government decides they don't want Stilicho in their territory because people, especially like Eutropius and Gainas, are afraid of losing their authority to Stilicho. So what the Eastern government does is they negotiate with Alaric and make a deal with him. And shockingly, their deal is to make him the Magister Militum, the master of soldiers, of Illyricum. So they're putting him as the chief military official of the disputed area between the east and the west. So that means that from 401 on, all of Alaric's wars will be against the west rather than the east, because the east had appeased him by giving him this appointment. And it's also possible that Alaric self-identified more as a Roman general than as a barbarian king, because that's another issue we're not going to get into, but a lot of these kings who had Roman titles may have actually seen themselves as more Roman than Visigothic or whatever. Anyway, despite the fact that the East clearly screwed over Stilicho, it looks like this was a fairly successful policy in a way, because Alaric didn't sack Athens again or attack any other cities in the Balkans. He was hammering the West now, and if you're worried about Stilicho taking over, then giving him a new obstacle to counter is a good thing. Also, if you're worried about losing Illyricum to Stilicho because he is bent on having it back, then putting the number one threat to your empire in that area means that if Stilicho wants it, he can get it by taking care of one of your problems. So it's actually pretty smart, albeit very corrupt and pretty typical of someone like Eutropius, who's a consummate schemer. Just so we're clear on how bad the relationship was between the East and the West at this time, there was actually a revolt in Africa against the Western government led by someone named Gildo, and this rebellion lasted for about a year from 397 to 398. Now, this posed a pretty big threat to the West because the city of Rome especially, but also all the cities of Italy, relied heavily on the grain output of what we now call Tunisia. That was the breadbasket of the West, whereas the East got most of its grain from Egypt. So it looks like Gildo knew about this tension, and he was trying to exploit the hostility between the East and the West. And there are some reports that there was a deal in the works where the West could reclaim Illyricum, but then Africa could fall to the East. And, you know, it was kind of implicitly understood that if that happened and the East secured Africa, then Gildo would be retained as the governor and, you know, could then set himself up to be sort of irreplaceable. He could basically become the J. Edgar Hoover of this era. But the Eastern government didn't end up taking up this offer or sending aid to Gildo. Possibly they thought that this was a betrayal too far, and they knew that aiding someone like this would be a little much. Or maybe this actually is a time when Arcadius stood up and said no, because obviously Gildo is revolting against his own brother. But I don't know. It's hard to say. And maybe this whole idea of the East being behind this revolt is a little exaggerated in our sources, which are really pushing this narrative of, you know, the East and the West being in a constant state of near war at all times. For this next part to really make sense, we need to talk a little bit more about why the Romans had such a strong prejudice against eunuchs and how they perceived them. So, the thing about eunuchs is that most of them were born as slaves. After all, no free man would willingly cut off his own testicles. And they were raised to be servants. And because they were raised to be servants, this meant that they were lower class. Also, eunuchs tended to come from the east, especially the eastern provinces. So we're talking about people from places like Syria, or maybe Palestine, or Egypt, or somewhere like that. And he was given a Greek name because he would have grown up in the Hellenistic sphere, the sort of area in the Eastern Empire which was dominated by Greek language and culture. So he was not someone with any kind of pedigree, and he most likely was born as a slave or was sold into slavery at some point in his early life. So he has a lot of things going against him in the minds of a tradition-minded Roman aristocrat already. And the fact that he's exercising power in the palace is already an offense to them. But he really goes overboard in their minds when he tries to claim formal authority and great fame, and not by pulling the strings, but by actually doing it himself. So in 398, he personally oversaw an eastern victory over a Hunnic invasion. This is a huge deal. Now, the Huns are not nearly the kind of power that they'll be under Attila later, but this is still a major threat to the Roman world, and this is a victory worth celebrating. Partly the reason why he might have had the command is because he had removed so many generals, but I don't know. Anyway, let's not rehash too much old ground. So, because of his great victory in 398, Eutropius was awarded with the consulship in the year 399, and he's the first eunuch to ever receive that honor. Now, because there are only 2 consuls at any one time, and this honor was highly sought after, this meant that many upper crust Romans are really furious, and they think that it is an insult to everything that Rome stands for that a eunuch would be allowed to hold this office. So they began plotting, and they began looking for an alternative. And during that same year, Gainas and Aelia Eudoxia become allies, and they decided to remove Eutropius. Maybe they shared this prejudice, or maybe they were just taking advantage of it. I don't know. At any rate, they remove Eutropius, and then despite the pleas of the Patriarch John Chrysostom, they have him executed before the year's end, meaning that his triumph is probably the worst of all Roman consuls. So, yeah, that was a hell of a downfall. And it's also a bit bittersweet for him because the person who he had put in power, Aelia Eudoxia, and also the person who he had allowed to have revenge on her father's murderer, had ultimately done him in. So the reign of Arcadius is a lot like Game of Thrones. Let's see what else happens. Tradition-bound Romans tended to be very ethnocentric, and one of the groups that they hated the most were the Germans, even the ones who had been settled within their own empire. In fact, elite sources often criticized Stilicho for his Vandal heritage and often questioned his loyalty to the empire. It's probably all the prejudice against him from people around Honorius that led Honorius to turn on him in the end. But anyway, so when there's an Ostrogothic revolt in Phrygia in 399, the orator Synesius from Cyrene visits the court and gives a speech to Arcadius called On the Office of King. And basically this speech is not so much about the general duties of a monarch as about how much he hates Germans and how they need to be excised from the army and replaced with real Romans. Ultimately, this political faction at court will be led by someone named Aurelian, who rises in favor and becomes the Praetorian prefect of the East after Eutropius is executed and his various supporters are removed. So this is basically a court faction which will now be active and trying to convince Arcadius to go along with its agenda. The thing that probably angered Aurelian and the anti-German faction is that the Germans at this time were doing extremely well in the Eastern Empire when it came to holding positions of power. So Gainas himself was a German general who was in the Roman service, and he was sent into Asia Minor to put down the revolt of Tribigild and the Ostrogoths. However, Gainas heard word of Aurelian's activities and the speech by Synesius, and he decided to join forces with Tribigild and then march on the capital and secure his interest. So Aurelian wisely resigned and left Gainas in control. And interestingly enough, the person Gainas chose to replace Aurelian was Aurelian's own brother, who was pro-German. So anyway, Gainas quickly tried to do things to help his people. So many German tribes at this time were Arian Christians rather than Orthodox or Catholic Christians. So Gainas tried to get an Arian church built in Constantinople, but he was basically denied. The powers that be would not allow it. The powers that be, of course, being all the Orthodox Romans around. So Gainas didn't really achieve much. He was basically stonewalled the entire time. He only ruled for about 6 months, and it seems like his only kind of accomplishment was that he did a mock execution of Aurelian to really humiliate and intimidate him when he first got there, and then after that he just tried to do things and people said no, and he wasn't able to get anything done. And then one time there was a riot in July of 400 and he was forced to flee. So not really the most glorious tenure in office. And ultimately, as you might imagine, this means that the anti-German faction now has more juice. So Aurelian comes back to office as Praetorian prefect, and his brother leaves. So, talk about nepotism. We have two brothers trading this office back and forth as court factions seize control back and forth. I'm just fascinated by the fact that these two guys are brothers, but they're, ardent political opponents, and they keep fighting for the same office. Again, just imagine, none of this would be possible if we had a competent, engaged, powerful emperor in Arcadius. Alright, So, Gainos is now declared to be a public enemy, and at this point, he's in open rebellion. He's just looking to loot, and the locals are all aware of his activities, so they all retreat to safe places. And Gainos is just riding around the countryside, not really accomplishing anything. And he decides to then try to cross the Hellespont and go back to Asia Minor. Maybe he'll find support there. The problem is, there's a Roman fleet that's arrived under a Gothic Roman general named Fravida, who had just won an anti-piracy campaign. So for whatever reason, Gainos, even though he's in sight of this fleet, mans his rafts and tries to land on the shores of Asia. And predictably, Fravida defeats him pretty severely. So Gainos' army is basically gone, and he is a refugee. Also, naval interception during this period was really difficult. However, it's not all that hard if you can actually see people. So, yeah, Gainos, he might have been an okay general, but he was a terrible admiral. At any rate, he was captured when he flees across the frontier to King Ulden the Hun, and Ulden knows which way the winds are blowing in Rome, so he cuts Gainos' head off and sends it to Arcadius as a gift for Christmas in the year 400. I actually don't know if Christmas was celebrated in December at this time. I'm just pulling that out of my ass, and I'm not going to look it up. So if you're curious about it, you can look it up. So who's left standing in Constantinople? Well, at this point, Aelia Eudoxia is winning the Game of Thrones. And her position is further entrenched by the fact that she has children with the reigning Emperor Arcadius, who contains the blood of the Theodosian dynasty. So these two daughters are not as good as sons. Obviously, you want sons first because your sons are the ones who carry on the line most effectively. But daughters are still a good start because, in case you don't have sons, you can still choose the next emperor by choosing who you marry the daughter to. At any rate, in January of 400, she is officially crowned as Augusta. And then Gainos falls several months later, and at this point, she's really the only person who has a lot of access to Arcadius and whom he trusts implicitly. And this will really start to establish a precedent for the next 50 years. So from this point in 400 all the way until the death of Arcadius' son, Theodosius II, we'll see that it's the women of the family who are the dominant political players among the Theodosian people. And Aelia Eudoxia presides over a sumptuous and lively court life. So people at her court are having a good time, partying, drinking, and all that fun stuff. And I have to imagine that the Emperor Arcadius wasn't really doing too much. He's probably sitting in his room or something, staring at the wall. But Eudoxia was having a good time, so, bully for her. The other major figure who was still around in 400 was the Patriarch of Constantinople, John Chrysostom. Chrysostom means golden-tongued. He was a great speaker. And he was a speaker who also could appeal to common people and not just the elite, who were used to having professional rhetors, regale them with great rhetoric and really obscure references. So he had been in power since 397, and unlike a lot of the major figures in the church from this period, he's not all that interested in theology, but rather his interest lies in practical morality, i.e., how do you live your life? What do you do in a given situation that you might actually encounter on a daily basis? John denounces the luxury of the rich in Constantinople and Antioch. He's not really into a luxurious lifestyle and the way that aristocrats and royals conduct themselves. And as part of that, he's also a defender of the poor and the downtrodden. He's, in some ways, someone who kind of has a bit of a socialist understanding of Christianity, which, as you might imagine, was not all that common among Roman aristocrats. And just to be clear, all of the great ecclesiastical figures of the ancient world were all people who came from the ranks of the aristocracy. So, just like most Christians who wanted to advance the power of the church, and especially Christians who are high-ranking members of the church, he wants to root out any practices which are not Christian. So he is actually in favor of the monks who are running around at this time destroying pagan shrines and committing violence. Um, and Arcadius, though, is a little less committed to that. Although Arcadius is also a pretty hardcore Christian, as far as we can tell, he is the emperor and he understands that, encouraging violence and rioting is probably not a very good idea for good government. But John Chrysostom doesn't have to deal with the enforcement of the law. He just has to deal with people who don't believe the same thing that he does. So I feel like that's a mark against him that rarely gets talked about. But yes, he's in favor of forcibly destroying other people's shrines and making them worship the way that you want them to. Predictably, the fact that Eudoxia likes to party and that John doesn't like the way that rich people conduct themselves leads to a conflict of interest between them. So how does that play out? Well, Chrysostom also inherits another issue, the rivalry between Constantinople and Alexandria for preeminence in the church. Now, by this point, it's kind of agreed that Rome is number one in terms of seniority of the sees. But after that, it's not quite as clear. Now, in 381, they decided that Constantinople was more senior than Alexandria, and Alexandria was only number 3. But because that decision was recent, and because Alexandria as a city had been around and been much more important in the rise of Christianity, they still thought that this was a winnable issue in the long run. So anytime there was a powerful patriarch in each city, they would clash heavily. And at this point, this happens once again. So, more or less what happens is these two guys come up with ridiculous accusations against each other of being heretics or being degenerates or whatever the case might be, and they would hold meetings of the church, so synods, to hear charges that were mostly personal and all about advancing the authority of one see or another. And the key player in all of this, since the time of Constantine, is always the emperor. All other things being equal, the emperor will get his way. And because Arcadius is a non-entity, this means that you need to have influence over the person who has influence over the emperor, and that would be the Empress Eudoxia. And the problem is that Chrysostom and Eudoxia have an on-again, off-again relationship in terms of whether they're getting along. And while he's in the middle of fighting Theophilus, Chrysostom makes a major error. He's walking around a garden with someone who is a snitch and talks to Eudoxia, and they come across a silver representation of Eudoxia, like some sort of engraving. And Chrysostom says that this engraving is pagan, that it's basically idolatry. Now, he's not saying Eudoxia is an idolater, but he is saying that this representation is something that he considers pagan. And she obviously does not agree with that because she also sees herself as an ardent Christian. So she's deeply offended, and she decides to side with Theophilus in this personal contest between the two bishops, and this results in Chrysostom getting exiled to Asia Minor. So, yeah, that was clearly about issues pertaining to really important things, and not some sort of personal vendetta that relied on the personal authority of one person who had a personal grudge and was clearly giving her influence to the person she liked better at that time on a whim. No, church politics are very important, and they're all about principles. Yeah. So you might think that the deposition of the Patriarch in Constantinople is not that big of a deal, because if you know anything about later Byzantine history, you know that the emperors make and unmake patriarchs all the time. However, this is also at a period when the papacy for the very first time is starting to really reach out and try to make its authority felt across the empire, including in areas in the east. So Honorius, who is under the influence of the Pope, writes to his brother Arcadius saying that he's outraged about the deposition of Chrysostom because the Patriarch of Constantinople should not be deposed without consulting the Bishop of Rome or the other emperor. But Arcadius apparently doesn't really respond or sort this out with his brother. And in 406, there's a Western Church delegation that comes to formally protest the deposition of Chrysostom and try to set up a more formal way to dismiss high-ranking bishops that would involve giving the papacy more power. Because remember, the only objective of the papacy across time is to increase its power and invent new powers for it that would enable it to control the affairs of other sees. However, that year, Arcadius snubs the Western delegation because he doesn't want to give up any of his power as emperor to control his own church to either the Western emperor or the Pope. And because of this, the two brothers will never speak again. As you might have already gathered, Arcadius is already nearing the end of his life, whereas Honorius will have to live with this, having died on bad terms with his brother for many years. So it's actually a little bit sad, especially that, the two brothers are at odds over something so trivial. Earlier, I was just kind of guessing that Arcadius and Honorius might have been close before their falling out. I don't actually know, and they wouldn't have actually seen each other in about 11 years since both of them are palace princes. However, the one person I know for a fact that Arcadius was close to was Eudoxia. So for 9 years by this point, they'd been married, and they had had a number of children together. But in October of 404, Eudoxia died following a miscarriage. That meant that because of that, and then the breakup with Honorius in 406, that Arcadius seems like he's pretty isolated, and he's even more withdrawn than ever. And his health is probably continuing to worsen at the same time. And this means that his new Praetorian prefect of the East, Flavius Anthemius, is now running the government, and Arcadius is just rubber stamping everything that he wants to do. Fortunately for Arcadius, Anthemius is a fairly competent person, unlike most of Arcadius's previous Praetorian prefects. So from 404 to 407, Anthemius spends his time trying to put down a revolt led by the Isaurians in Asia Minor. The Isaurians are a people who had been a part of the Roman Empire for a long time, but had never actually been fully integrated. And later on, we'll even have an Isaurian emperor, not too far in the future. Anyway, Anthemius dealt with that, and he also had to deal with Stilicho and Alaric in the west. Both of them are still a threat that Eutropius had not dealt with. And obviously Stilicho will meet his end at the hands of Honorius when he eventually turns on his general. And Alaric will be around until 408. I mean, not 408, but 410, a couple years after Arcadius has already kicked the bucket. But Anthemius will still be around and observing these events with a lot of scrutiny. On May 1st, 408, Arcadius died at the age of 31. And there seems to be a tendency among the Theodosian emperors to be pretty frail and sickly, but none of them were more frail or sickly than Arcadius. Now, Arcadius does have a monument to him that still stands in modern Istanbul, the Column of Arcadius, which was completed in the reign of his son Theodosius II, and this commemorates the glorious victory that Arcadius's men had over Gynos when Gynos was in rebellion. You remember that battle with the rafts where the warships beat the rafts and it was like really shocking? That is the cause for this column. So if you ever go to Istanbul and see it, remember, you too can get a column if you can take warships and manage to defeat rafts. Or, even better, if you can order someone on your behalf to defeat rafts of warships. So, easiest way to get a column, most likely in history. Now, when Arcadius died, he had a 7-year-old son and heir named Theodosius II and 4 daughters, the most important of whom was Pulcheria, who we'll learn more about when we talk about Theodosius II, who inherited his father's more or less non-existent personality. But hopefully it will be a long time before I get around to that, because I'm sick of talking about people who are really, 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 really boring. It's very easy to fall into the trap of not regarding Theodosius II as being very important. He was, after all, a palace prince, he never led an army into battle, and he rarely ventured far from Constantinople. However, the man did reign for 42 years, and over the course of that 42-year period, the Eastern Empire changed quite a bit and became quite a bit closer to what we now think of as Byzantium. And this is also the period of time during which the West started to really decline and fall apart. And it was under the leadership of Theodosius II and his various ministers that the East more or less began to turn a blind eye to the West and focus more on their own internal issues. So let's look at Theodosius II and his long reign from 408 to 450 and talk about his role, for good or bad, in molding the Eastern Empire into Byzantium. In 408, Arcadius died at the young age of 31 and left his son Theodosius II in power at just age 7. So this meant that the government had to fall to a regency. And the regency was headed by none other than Anthemius, who was the Praetorian prefect who had served under Arcadius for 8 years already. He would soldier on for another 6 years under Theodosius II. Now, Anthemius is generally regarded by most historians as being one of the greatest of the Praetorian prefects of the East, and one of the greatest civil servants in all of late Roman history. Among his achievements, he oversaw a new treaty with Persia. He dealt with a grain shortage in 408, and after dealing with that immediate crisis, he then went on to improve the logistics of the Egyptian grain supply to make sure that something like that wouldn't happen in the future. He also helped war-ravaged Illyria. That area had been hammered by the Visigoths under Alaric, and he gave imperial aid to help rebuild towns there. And in 414, his last year in office, he remitted all tax arrears which dated back from 368 to 407. And that was something that officials had to do once in a while, because after a certain amount of time, it would become impossible to catch up on taxes if you were decades behind. So all in all, Anthemius left office with an excellent reputation, and he did a lot to set the government in good standing going forward. Arguably, none of the things I talked about above would be enough to put Anthemius in the first rank of historical figures from the 5th century. However, one thing that he did make sure that his reputation lives on, and it also ensured that Theodosius II's name would be remembered, and that was the building of the Theodosian walls. Anthemius is the guy who supervises construction and had the major oversight of the project, and this project would be completed in 413, the second to last year of Anthemius' tenure as Praetorian prefect. What the Theodosian walls did is extend Constantinople's perimeter a great deal beyond what the Constantinian walls had done in the 4th century. And these walls not only made Constantinople bigger and enabled it to grow more, but these walls were much more fortified and formidable than the older walls. Now, eventually these walls will come to be seen as inseparable from Constantinople's identity, and it will be these very walls which for the next 1,000 years will prove to be the greatest of all medieval fortifications. So this is the main reason why people still remember Anthemius, and also the reason why later Byzantines would still know who Theodosius II was. In 414, Anthemius disappears from history. Most likely he died, and at that point, Pulcheria, who was Theodosius II's older sister, assumed the role of regent, and she would hold that role for 2 years until 416, when Theodosius II would turn 15 and come into power in his own right. Pulcheria adopted Aurelian as her Praetorian prefect to replace Anthemius, and Aurelian is a veteran of the pro-Roman versus pro-German conflict, which had really racked the reign of Arcadius. If you want a reminder on that, I suggest you look up my video on Arcadius. Now, Pulcheria is an interesting figure, and she will remain a key element in Theodosius' government for the entirety of his reign. She's different from her siblings, her 2 sisters and her brother Theodosius, in that she has a dominant personality and she tries to assert herself in all matters. Now, one thing that all of the children of Arcadius had in common is that they're all very religious. So Pulcheria, Arcadia, and Marina, the 3 sisters, all took vows of virginity, and in doing so they were encouraged by the patriarch Atticus, who actually wrote an entire book praising virginity. Now, this decision would have repercussions way down the line when there were no heirs for Theodosius II, but at the time, this may have seemed like a good idea since it prevented the growth of cadet branches of the Theodosian dynasty. Now, when she took over as regent, Pulcheria took Theodosius under her wing and really directed his education. And apparently, her main concern was making sure that he deported himself properly. So they spent a lot of time talking about manners and ceremony and things of that nature. One of the defining characteristics of Theodosius's court life is that because Pulcheria and the other two sisters, Arcadia and Marina, were so religious and were lifelong virgins, the court tended to be very austere and it felt more like a convent than a traditional Roman imperial court. Now, if you remember back to the court of Arcadius, which was run by his wife Eudoxia, it was a place where there was song and dance and drinking and fun. But the court of Theodosius is basically the opposite of that. It is run like a monastery or a convent. Now, this means that this is one of the characteristics that will really distinguish the age of Theodosius from what comes before and after. And another interesting fact about this court is that most of the visitors are monks and bishops. They're not generals or officials or famous writers or anything like that. So, to put it bluntly, this was probably the most boring time to be a courtier in all of Roman or Byzantine history. Let's take a moment to talk about Theodosius's personality. Now, unlike his father Arcadius, it does seem like Theodosius had a personality that you can actually describe using words. He was charming, he was popular with the Senate and the people, so apparently when he would ride about the city, people would wave at him, he could talk the talk, and generally people were well disposed towards him and kind of liked him. He did share the religious zeal of his father and his siblings, however, although we don't know of anything like him taking a vow of virginity or anything like that, but his very tolerance of Pulcheria's idea of what a court should be does heavily imply that he was just as religious, or at least very close to as religious as his siblings and other immediate family. Now, Theodosius's main interest as a person were actually scholarly. He was actually a very learned man. But his interests were all in secular learning, not in things like theology. So his favorite subjects were classical authors, so he read a lot of Greek and Latin historians. He liked math, he liked natural science, astronomy, but his main interest, the thing that really got him up in the morning, was that he was really interested in illustrating and illuminating manuscripts. And by this point, we have manuscripts that are in codex form, and a codex is basically a book rather than in the old-fashioned scrolls. So because of that, and because of this interest, his sobriquet was Theodosius the Calligrapher. The most important thing that happened while Pulcheria was holding the regency was a civil disturbance in Alexandria. Now, civil disturbances in Alexandria were pretty much par for the course. Alexandria was extremely riot-prone, and people would fight each other in the streets over things that seem pretty trivial and arcane to us. They would fight over matters of theology. Well, Cyril decided to provoke anti-pagan sentiment in the city, and the reason that he did this is simply because he wanted to elevate his see's prominence above Antioch and Constantinople. And he wanted to do that by making sure that Alexandria had a reputation for cracking down harder on paganism than the other two cities. So, that is part of a larger context, by the way, where Rome had already claimed the first spot in terms of preeminence among the churches, but the other slots were up for grabs. It was kind of assumed Constantinople would be number 2 because it's an imperial center, but Antioch and Alexandria have much deeper histories, and they also have produced way more theologians in the early 5th century. So, if you're a bishop of Alexandria, you feel like this is a winnable fight. And for Cyril, he decides to take the low road. So what he does is he whips up Alexandria into another fervor, and this, by the way, also puts him in conflict with the civil governor of Egypt, who, as you might imagine, is not a big fan of huge riots, since that is his job to deal with all the chaos that Cyril is going to create. So Alexandria gets up into a hot fervor, and in the midst of that fervor, some really fired up Christian monks decide to go after a pagan philosopher named Hypatia. She's a famous philosopher and mathematician. Depending on the year of birth that you accept, she was either in her 40s or her 70s at the time. Anyway, she was famous for going around through the streets and explaining Plato and other philosophers to common people on the streets. Like I said, Alexandria is kind of a nerd camp. Anyway, her death is really something that became sort of a mark against the administration of Theodosius, and ultimately it was something which helped to divide the court. Different people had different feelings about what had happened, but because the sort of bigoted brand of Christianity was current with people like Cyril and Pulcheria, it managed to stick, and no one was ever punished for creating this condition where people could be murdered in the streets. If I may be excused for breaking chronology, let's go ahead and look at the anti-pagan activities conducted by Theodosius II and his administration more broadly, since the subject has now been broached. In 423, Theodosius II confidently claimed that there were no pagans left in his territory. Now, we know that this claim is completely false because we have archaeology now, and we know that we can find pagan idols and other things all the way up until about the 8th century in rural parts of the Byzantine Empire. So, this claim is pretty false. So we also know it's false, even without archaeology, because in 435, Theodosius II issues repeated prohibitions against sacrifices and orders existing temples to be converted into churches, which obviously implies that there are still pagans out there doing their thing. For the most part, though, 5th century persecution is not like the persecution that we see in the period of the Inquisition in the late Middle Ages. It's more or less limited to stopping people from practicing their religion, and it rarely ventures into attacking them for the way that they think or believe, or even what they write. However, there was an exception made. In 448, Theodosius and maybe somebody at his court became aware of Porphyry's against the Christians, which was an old text where Porphyry tried to discredit the validity of the Bible and of Christian doctrine. And he ordered that that book be burned. And while we don't know for sure, there's a good possibility that this burn order was extended to Celsus, who I think wrote before Porphyry, and then Julian the Apostate, the 4th century emperor, who wrote in the tradition of Celsus and Porphyry. And in the case of all three of these anti-Christian authors, we only have them preserved in Christian writings where someone will do large quotes of the earlier work and then write their own refutation or try to explain why the attempted refutation of Porphyry or Celsus or Julian is wrong. So, as I mentioned previously, Theodosius II officially took up the government in his own name when he turned 15 in 416. The first order that issued directly from Theodosius II that we know of is from 419, when he ordered his sister Pulcheria to go find him a wife and empress. So Pulcheria ended up finding an Athenian girl named Athenias. She was a beautiful, learned daughter of an Athenian professor who had recently died, and she came to court looking for a redress to her grievances. But when Pulcheria met her, she knew that this should be Theodosius's wife, and so she introduced the two, and Theodosius had to have her. But because she was the daughter of an Athenian professor and Athens was still a very pagan university town, Eudokia, as her name would become after she converted, had to convert to Christianity, and she had to have a sponsor, which was her future sister-in-law Pulcheria. And she ended up going through a course. She learned Christianity, and then she married Theodosius in 421. Eudokia has one unique distinction about her above all else, because we're going to talk about her quite a bit in this video. She actually wrote Christian poetry, and that survived. And the reason that's important is because there are very few surviving female authors from antiquity, and she is one of them. And one interesting thing about her poetry is that it shows off her educational background from her pre-Christian days, because she uses a lot of Homeric language, and she also employs lots of classical themes and imagery in her Christian poems. And within a few years, she'd given birth to a daughter or two, and that meant that her influence in the eyes of Theodosius was greater than that of Pulcheria, and that would cause a lifelong feud between them. After all, Pulcheria, in sponsoring Athenias, thought that she was creating a new empress who would more or less be subject to her strong personality. What she didn't bank on, however, is that the newly created Eudokia had a very strong personality of her own, and that someone is naturally going to tend to gravitate toward their own wife more than their sister. By 423, there were already two very powerful women in the form of the empresses Pulcheria and Eudokia. But a third would arrive very shortly, and this was Galla Placidia, who was the aunt of Theodosius II. She was born in 388. She had originally been married to King Ataulf of the Visigoths, the successor to Alaric, the man who sacked Rome, and she had served as his wife for 1 year from 414 to 415. Then Ataulf had died, and she had come to live at Honorius' court. Actually, the sequence of events is a little more complicated. She was at Rome for a while, then at Ravenna. Doesn't matter. Eventually, though, she went to Honorius' court and married Constantius III, who was a friend and colleague of Honorius. However, Theodosius II had never been consulted about making Constantius an emperor, so he refused to recognize Constantius' legitimacy, and the issue became moot when Constantius died in 421. Now, around this time, Honorius began to develop inappropriate feelings for his sister Placidia, and he began to make moves on her. Well, as one does, she did not quite feel comfortable with that, so she packed up and she brought her children to Theodosius' court. So now we have 3 different women who claim to be the Empress of Rome and only one emperor. Despite the concern I expressed above about having 3 empresses in one place, the fact is that they didn't have to coexist for long, and for the short period that they did live together, it looks like they lived harmoniously, and that all of the children were also satisfied because they had more playmates, and things were pretty peaceful. But that peace was broken on August 15th, 423, when Honorius died suddenly of dropsy at the age of 38. Now, the problem with Honorius dying like he did is that he had no clear heir. And because of that, this enabled a patrician named Castinus to elevate a bureaucrat named Joannes to the throne. Joannes is a pretty minor figure, and someone who was literally chosen to be the puppet for Castinus. So Theodosius now has a dilemma, and it's the first major decision that he'll really have to make as emperor. Does he unite the whole empire under himself by conquering Joannes? And by whole empire, I mean, does he add coastal Italy to his holdings? Or does he simply install his young cousin Valentinian III, the son of Galla Placidia, as emperor of the West, and then let the West deal with its own problems? After all, if he does take over the West directly, then he has to deal with the issue of responding to all of the various crises which continue to erupt on a daily basis. So ultimately what he decides is to put Valentinian III on the throne of the Western Empire. So as I mentioned, Theodosius was at a crossroads, and he decided to install his cousin Valentinian III on the throne in the West. And in order to make sure that he himself benefited from this action, he decided that Valentinian III and his daughter would get married when they both came of age. At this time, Valentinian was a child, and his daughter was also very underage. And just to sweeten the pot a little bit more, it was decided that Illyria would revert to Eastern control. It had been given to the West at some point, but now this was going to revert to Eastern control. So Theodosius was going to get something out of installing his cousin other than influence. So he put together a large expedition under the command of Artaburius and his son Aspar. And after a considerable struggle with some radical changes of fortune, Artaburius was actually captured at one point. This expedition managed to overcome Joannes. Now, Theodosius, after this expedition had won, was eager to travel west and crown Valentinian in person, but while he was on the route, he actually fell sick at Thessalonica and was unable to complete his journey. So the Patriarch of Constantinople went instead. Now, because Valentinian III was underage, Placidia served as his regent from 425 until 437, when Valentinian III turned 18 and assumed control in his own name. The expedition against Joannes in of itself was not really that big of a deal. However, there were three young men present who distinguished themselves and would go on to play great roles in the affairs of both the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire. Those three men are Aspar, Boniface, and Flavius Aetius. So, let's start with Aspar, who was one of the generals on the eastern expedition. He was the son of Commander Artiberius, and he commanded his own expeditionary subforce. Well, when Artiberius was captured after his fleet was hit by a storm, Aspar was the one who ended up winning the campaign, and he managed to even take Ravenna by navigating through the swamps and taking the city by surprise. If you know anything about late Roman and early Byzantine history, you know that Ravenna was the most formidable point in Italy, and that taking it by siege or by surprise was extremely difficult. So that's a pretty big deal that Aspar was able to do that, and it really established him as one of, if not the premier general of his age. Artiberius was rewarded for this success with a consulship in 427, and then his son Aspar was rewarded in 434 with the consulship. As for Boniface, he was later very famous in Africa as a count, but he made his debut during this war as one of the key followers of Galla Placidia and someone who came out to support her. Flavius Aetius, who later became known as the guy who defeated Attila the Hun, was still very young at this time, and he had joined up with Joannes. And because he had been a hostage at the court of the Huns before this, he was sent to hire Hun mercenaries, and apparently he was able to hire a pretty large army. But by the time that Aetius and his Hun mercenaries returned to Italy, the war was over. So Aetius had to buy his position with Placidia by using the threat of these Huns as sort of a bargaining chip. And ultimately, she gave him a position, and he was able to figure out a way to pay off these Huns and get them out of Roman territory. So that is how he eventually would go on to rise to high command. One of the signal accomplishments of Theodosius's long reign was the establishment of the University of Constantinople in 425. This university was designed to compete with schools in Alexandria and Athens in terms of prestige, and I imagine that the foundation of this university probably had something to do with that conflict that I mentioned earlier between the various sees of the empire competing for precedence. So it's probably related to that in some way, but the main purpose was to produce men for the church and the bureaucracy who had the necessary skills to understand the finer points of theology and to manage the empire. This university would expand over time, and there was actually a larger expansion a decade or two after its foundation. And if you look at the initial university, we see that there are actually more professors of Greek rhetoric than Latin rhetoric, and many of the old school historians, the guys who are really concerned about ethnicity and things like that, will point to this as sort of this time when the Eastern Empire starts to become more Greek and less Roman. I think there's something to be said for that, but I think it's also very important to keep in mind that this process of the Eastern Empire taking on its Greek identity and starting to use more Greek in its daily life was a very long process, and we should also remember that they never quit calling themselves the Romans, and they never really quit being Roman. Another important project which took place under Theodosius and tightly coincided with the foundation of the University of Constantinople was the compilation of the Theodosian Code. It took about 9 years between 429 and 438 to compile this new law code. What it is basically scholars of law took all of the various imperial edicts since the time of Constantine I and eliminated any redundant or contradictory laws. And eventually, when both emperors Theodosius II and Valentinian III were together for a wedding, we'll talk about the circumstances of that later on, they issued this jointly, and this became the new law code of the Roman Empire. Now, laws that are recorded in this code are important sources for conditions that obtained in the late Roman Empire. We can learn quite a bit about things like whether there were still pagans around, because we can see that emperors will continue to issue laws against them, and that implies that this is still an active thing. And while the Justinian's Code is much better known and much better studied, However, the basis of Justinian's code was this code by Theodosius, and basically the scholars under Justinian, like Tribonian, who would take up that task, would more or less use this as a basis and then modernize it and expand it. One of the defining elements of Byzantine history is that Byzantium was always beset by intense theological disagreements. And yet another one of those cropped up in the middle of Theodosius's reign, and this is called the Nestorian controversy. So what is it? Well, basically the Nestorian controversy takes its name from the Patriarch of Constantinople named Nestorius, who was in office from 428 to 431. And his teaching, which roused such backlash, was that Christ had two distinct natures, one divine and one human. This led him into a conflict with Bishop Cyril of Alexandria. As we mentioned earlier, Cyril was constantly engaged in trying to increase the supremacy of the See of Alexandria. And one way to do that was to take down the bishops of other sees, especially the Bishop of Constantinople, who would be his primary opponent. So Cyril managed to get in a what's it called, a synod held in 431, and at this synod, Cyril and his highly orthodox followers were able to condemn Nestorius as a heretic before all of the other delegates could arrive. Nestorius, though, actually lived on for another 19 years and didn't die until 450, so his last 19 years he lived as a heretic who was out of favor with the administration. Now, Nestorianism itself, however, despite being condemned in 431, lived on for many centuries. It survived in Syria, and it was the dominant form of Christianity when the Arab conquest took place. In addition, it actually spread as far east as China. This drawing is actually from a Nestorian group in China. I'm not sure exactly when Nestorianism died out in China, but it lasted for quite a while, well into the Middle Ages. In the mid-420s, Theodosius II had intervened in Italy and installed his cousin Valentinian III as emperor. And now, in late 437, he was finally going to reap the rewards for his actions. So, his cousin Valentinian III traveled to Constantinople to consummate his marriage with Licenia Eudoxia, Theodosius' daughter, and they were married at Constantinople. This is the probable occasion when the territory in Illyria that was part of the West was reapportioned to the Eastern Empire, and it added enough to Theodosius' realm that his Praetorian prefect of Illyricum had to shift his capital from Thessalonica to Sirmium, which was a great deal farther to the west and would be able to cover this new frontier. While they were there together in Constantinople, the two emperors jointly issued the Theodosian Code, and this showed the unity of the East and the West. It's also worth noting that this is the last time that the East and the West will have a legal unity where each half is following the same exact laws, because after Valentinian returns to the West, emperors in the East and the West will continue to add their own edicts, and they're not always universally adopted by the other, so law will begin to fragment and separate once again after this correction. So back when her daughter had been betrothed to Valentinian III, the Empress Eudokia said that she would do a pilgrimage of thanksgiving if that marriage occurred the way that it was supposed to. So after this marriage goes down in the fall of 437, Eudokia set out on a pilgrimage to the east destined for Jerusalem. Now, she gave a speech along the way at Antioch, which was a highly Christian city, which had a long history of being Christian. And this speech was greatly applauded, and the city absolutely loved her. She had impeccable Greek. Like I said, she was a highly educated woman and an excellent speaker and writer. And the city loved her eloquence so much that they actually built a statue to her. When she visited Jerusalem, she toured all the holy sites, and she brought back some relics to Constantinople, one of which would be the centerpiece in one of the city's major churches. And because of this pilgrimage, Eudokia would gain a lot of prestige for her piety. And because that was kind of Pulcheria's bag, she was not happy about it, and it's from this time forward when the tension between Eudokia and Pulcheria reaches levels that can't really be sustained, and this will ultimately destroy their relationship. And now for one of those instances when slander and gossip go down in the history books. So let's start with the known facts. In 440, there was an official named Paulinus. He was a high-ranking official, and he was a lifelong friend of Theodosius II. For reasons unknown, he lost favor, and he was executed. Now, in at least one account, this execution took place because Theodosius suspected Paulinus of having an adulterous relationship with the Empress Eudokia. And the reason for that is for one of the more implausible stories in this period. So what happens is Theodosius saw a prized apple somewhere and he bought it because he wanted to give it to the Empress as a gift. And this was the biggest apple he'd ever seen. And then the Empress had it, and she decided to give it as a gift to Paulinus because she wanted to reward him for something. And then Paulinus needed to give a gift to Theodosius, so he regifted it to him. And then Theodosius recognized the apple, knew where it had to have come from, and assumed that there was an intimate relationship between the two of them, and on a whim had Paulinus executed. Or maybe there was an exile before the execution. But at any rate, that's what ended up happening. However, there's really not a lot of reason to buy this story. This was probably something that was inserted in the history books by Pulcheria, who survived all of the other actors, at least in terms of having influence in Constantinople. And it also doesn't really make sense because in the account where this story is given off as fact, Eudokia left immediately to go to on her extended pilgrimage, but in reality she actually didn't leave until 443, and she continued to deny this story even when she was on her deathbed in 460. We also don't know all that much about Paulinus, but it also seems like he was generally considered an honorable man, and it seems fairly unlikely that he would take such a big risk as to have an affair with one of his best friend's wives, especially if his best friend is the emperor. So anyway, this is just yet another great example of what happens when gossip gets recorded as history, and how you can kind of read between the lines if you look carefully enough. So, the larger story of the apple is that Eudokia and Pulcheria were rivals now. They had probably been rivals for a while, but now things are getting to a breaking point. And this is probably why Eudokia decides to abandon Constantinople and live the rest of her life in Jerusalem. Dealing with Pulcheria is simply too much. So, it's probable for that reason, in my opinion at least, that Pulcheria is the source of the apple story, and she's the one that tried to tie the fall of Paulinus in 440 with Eudokia's departure in 443, and that she tried to imply guilt because of that. And if you look at the rivalry that they already had over piety, then it kind of makes sense that Pulcheria would want to paint Eudokia as an adulteress, because then that makes her less pious than the lifelong virgin Pulcheria. Anyway, there's also another story which also seems a little weird and gossipy and petty, that there was a spat between the two over the prestige of their entourage, because Pulcheria had a chamberlain, and when Eudokia found out that Pulcheria had a chamberlain, she wanted one for herself. After all, she is the empress who is the mother of children, and not just the emperor's sister, who holds the title of empress but doesn't actually, have sex with the emperor, to put it frankly. But Theodosius, when she brought this complaint to him, said, "No, you may not have a chamberlain. That is an honor reserved for my sister." And that apparently incensed Eudokia enough that she was, ready to call it quits, and she also at this point had no desire to see Theodosius any longer. There also are reports that the eunuch Chrysaphius is one of the people who was really driving this rivalry forward to advance himself, because if one of these imperial women loses favor, or hopefully both of them lose favor, then at that point Theodosius has to turn to another source for advice, and that could be Chrysaphius. However, blaming Chrysaphius for this might not be accurate, because as a eunuch, he generally will tend to get blamed for everything anyway, regardless of whether it's actually his fault. And a lot of the speculation that it was his fault comes from the mere fact that he was the guy who rose up to be the next major advisor. But there's really no way to then prove that he was driving forward all of this court drama. Anyway, let's move on to other stuff. In 443, Eudokia left Constantinople and never returned. She would spend the last 17 years of her life, from 443 until 460, in Jerusalem. Within several months of her arrival in Jerusalem, Theodosius sent one of his bodyguards, and then that bodyguard executed two prominent members of Eudokia's entourage. So there was some definite tension between Theodosius and his wife, but there's really no reason to think that it was because of Paulinus. It was more likely because of the spat with Pulcheria. Anyway, so at some point, for reasons unknown, Eudokia adopted the Monophysite belief, which is basically the idea that there's only one nature of God, and that is divine. And this was later labeled a heresy, and at some point Eudokia conferred with the Pope Leo the Great, and she was returned to Orthodoxy. Remember, at this time there was no distinction between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, so that is why it says what it says on your screen. Now, while she was in Jerusalem, she spent the majority of her time doing charitable work and making various improvements to the city of Jerusalem. So her stay in Jerusalem was not without results, and eventually, just like her rival Pulcheria, she would go down as a saint in the Orthodox Church. The period from 443 to 450, the last phase of Theodosius' reign, is what I would call the control of Chrysapius, since Chrysapius became the primary advisor to Theodosius for these years. Now, when Eudokia left, you might think that Pulcheria would return to favor and be the emperor's primary advisor, but that's not how it worked out. For whatever reason, there was some tension between Pulcheria and Theodosius. I assume it's because he held both of them responsible for the breakdown of their family, and he was bitter. Anyway, for whatever reason, Chrysapius will now become the major advisor. And the major topic that Chrysapius and Theodosius will have to deal with during these last 7 years is the crisis caused by the rise of a newly emboldened Hunnic Empire under a charismatic leader, Attila. So let's look at the nature of the Hunnic threat to the Eastern Roman Empire. Before 430, Theodosius and his predecessors hadn't really had many major experiences of direct contact with the Huns. There hadn't been a lot of direct conflict. Sometimes the Romans would hire Huns as mercenaries or send embassies back and forth, but there hadn't really been any deep engagement. In 430, Theodosius II agreed to pay an annual subsidy of 350 pounds of gold to the Huns, and this was designed to keep them happy and keep them out of his territory. In 441, Theodosius had sent an eastern field army to Africa to try to stop the Vandals. They did not. And during that time, Attila struck into the Balkans. And this led to an extended war for the next 5 or 6 years, when Theodosius and his armies were fighting in vain against Attila. Actually, Theodosius' armies, Theodosius never left the capital. And during the course of that time, Attila was able to besiege and sack several major cities in the Balkans. It's worth noting that one thing that made the Huns different than the Goths is that the Huns were excellent at siege warfare, so they posed a much greater threat when they were actually invading Roman territory. At the end of that conflict, around 446 or 447 even, Theodosius agreed to pay 6,000 pounds of gold for violating the treaty. Apparently, at least according to Attila, the war was Theodosius' fault, and he had to agree to 2,100 pounds of gold as annual tribute, and also the cost for ransoming back the captured Roman soldiers was going to be expensive. When people think of Attila, they realize that he was a threat to both halves of the Roman Empire, but most people really focus on his campaign in Gaul. However, in 447 he launched what may have been his largest operation, and it was against the Eastern Empire. And this was divided into 2 or 3 different armies, one of which was able to penetrate as far south as the famous mountain pass at Thermopylae. The other force under Attila himself defeated a Roman army, swept it aside, and then marched on to Constantinople itself and tried to lay siege. However, the Theodosian walls were proving their worth finally. This is the first siege that these walls had endured, and they proved too much for Attila, even with his mastery of siege warfare, especially when they were manned by newly recruited Isaurian troops. And we'll talk a lot about the Isaurians when we talk about Leo the First and Zeno. And these new troops, along with the walls, were enough to force Attila to retreat from Constantinople and ultimately go back across the Danubian frontier, but not before he did tons and tons of damage to the Balkans. So, as I mentioned earlier, my sort of opinion on the court life of Theodosius is that he was really depressed by the falling out between his sister and his wife, and that this sort of led him to become more withdrawn in general. So, as I mentioned earlier, he spent most of the 440s dealing with the threat of the Huns, and he didn't really have either his sister or his wife nearby, and that must have been very difficult for him on a personal level. There are some accounts that he began to lose interest in the affairs of government, and that he got to the point where he would just more or less sign state papers without really reading them, and that he was kind of withdrawn and had given up. Early in 450, he fell off of his horse and he suffered a severe spinal injury, which after several months would eventually kill him. Since this series is dedicated to the Byzantine Empire and not the West, I haven't focused much on what has been happening in the West except when it involves the Eastern Emperor or an army from the East. However, I think it's just worth noting right now what the situation looked like in 450. When Theodosius died. This is what had become of the West. You see that it is deeply divided and that the empire is very much falling apart. So keep in mind that Theodosius, during his long reign, presided over considerable decay in the West. As I mentioned earlier, in early 450, Theodosius fell from his horse and suffered a severe spinal injury, which would eventually kill him. So over the next several months, he turns to his sister Pulcheria, his only surviving sibling. His other two sisters have died, and they managed to patch up their relationship. From the looks of it, it looks like Pulcheria, by this point, regained her influence, and Chrysafius took a back seat. So, with no sons and all of his other sisters being either dead or virgins or both, Pulcheria was now the sort of vessel through which the Theodosian line would pass. So the plan was for Pulcheria to figure out a marriage arrangement where she could choose the next emperor by marrying someone, but come up with some weird marriage arrangement where she wouldn't be forced to have sex with that person. And with or without Theodosius's prior consent, and it's not really clear how able he would have been to select someone at this point, given his injuries, Pulcheria selected Marcian to be her husband and therefore new emperor. And apparently there's a meeting between Theodosius II and Marcian where Theodosius says, "So I understand that you've been selected to be the new emperor." And just the way that that's phrased in the passive voice kind of implies that Pulcheria, as the person who was carrying the Theodosian bloodline, got to choose anybody she wanted, and she chose Marcian. Anyway, Theodosius was still bedridden, and he eventually died on July 28, 450, at the age of 49. In 450, Marcian ascended to the Byzantine throne, and he would rule until his death in 457. Now, Marcian gets a very positive press in our sources, but in this video I'd like to suggest that a lot of that press was more or less undeserved and had to do with the fact that he was a patron of the elite, and that the elite went on to write all the histories about Marcian's reign. Let's take a look back at the circumstances which led to the rise of Marcian to the imperial throne. So in 450, Theodosius II was on his deathbed, and he had never had a male heir. His one daughter had been married off to his cousin Valentinian III. So that was one option. He could leave the empire to Valentinian III, the emperor of the West, and then that would reunite the East and West and leave the entire empire in the hands of members of the Theodosian dynasty. He also had another option. Of his three sisters, one of them was still alive, but Pulcheria, the remaining sister, was actually older than Theodosius. She was in her early 50s, and she had taken a vow of virginity as a teenager and therefore had never had any children herself. So what was Theodosius to do? Well, it looks like Pulcheria decided to make the choice for him. So during the last several years of Theodosius's reign, he and his sister Pulcheria had been at odds due to a falling out between Pulcheria and Theodosius's wife, the Empress Eudokia. However, while Theodosius was on his deathbed, he and Pulcheria were able to reconcile with one another. And as a part of that process, or so it would seem, Theodosius became willing to allow Pulcheria to realize her ambitions. Now, early in his own reign, Pulcheria had been one of the chief powers behind the throne, and then she had lost a lot of her influence to Eudokia. However, now with Eudokia in perpetual self-exile in Jerusalem, and Theodosius dying, Pulcheria was able to step forward, and Theodosius was going to leave the scene soon, so he decided that this might be a decent parting gift to his wife. And I'm sort of guessing at what happened when I'm talking about like how Theodosius came to terms with Pulcheria getting to make this choice. The actual circumstances are a little murky. Anyway, so again, Pulcheria had taken a vow to remain a virgin as a teenager, and she had no intention of ever breaking that. But what she and her brother worked out is that she could set up a special marriage where, while it would be a legal marriage, she would not be required to have sex with her new husband, and that husband could then hold the imperial throne. So, kind of an odd arrangement to work around the excessive religiosity of Pulcheria, but again, you know, people do weird things for family, I guess. And she decided to pick a senator who was in good stead with Aspar, who was the senior military official in the east at this time, and one of the major power brokers. We'll talk a lot more about Aspar in my next video on Leo the First, by the way. And the man that Pulcheria picked to be her platonic husband was someone named Marcian. Marcian had a long and interesting life behind him when he ascended to the throne in 450. In 392, he was born in either Thrace or Illyricum. Both of these areas are famous for producing a large number of the soldiers in the Byzantine army during this period. He followed in that tradition by becoming a soldier, and he rose through the ranks rather quickly, which sort of implies he was probably of a relatively high social background. And he was the tribune of his unit by the 420s. We're not sure exactly what date, but somewhere in that time period. One detail that we know about him, which ended up working in his favor, is that while he was on the way to fight a war on the Persian front, he fell ill and had to be left behind. And he ended up at Constantinople, and there he served as domesticus under Artiberius and Aspar. That's sort of a lower military official, so he was able to get the attention of Artiberius, who was the guy who commanded the big expedition in Italy under the direction of Theodosius II, which installed Valentinian III, and then Aspar, who was the real hero of that campaign and the son of Artiberius. So having that connection to both of these guys really made Marcian's career. Later, he was sent in a failed expedition to Africa in 431, and supposedly there is a tale that he was captured and brought before King Gaiseric of the Vandals, and that he swore that he would never again make war upon the Vandals or disturb the peace of Africa. And people use this story to explain why Marcian never sent a retaliatory strike to Africa after the sack of Rome in 455. And again, because this guy is super well connected, he was able to serve as the captain of the palace guards at one point in the 430s or maybe the 440s, maybe some time period bridging those two decades. What we do know is that by 450 he had left military service and he was a senator at Constantinople who was 58 years old. Immediately upon assuming the throne, Marcian made his opening move, which was to execute the eunuch Chrysafius, who had been Theodosius's advisor for the last several years of his reign. And the reason I say that this was almost certainly done at Pulcheria's insistence is because the two of them had been bitter rivals for influence with Theodosius II, and you can see here that that would make a lot of sense that Pulcheria would want to take him out, since she was trying to move on and be the primary advisor to the throne for her new husband. Marcian almost immediately ended Byzantium's annual gold subsidies to Attila the Hun. Those had been instituted by Theodosius II, and that was seen as the best and most cost effective way to prevent Attila from ravaging the Eastern Empire. Theodosius II actually had some fairly good reasons for having those subsidies. He had had some close calls during his reign, but Marcian decided to end those immediately. And some of his contemporary historians, the guys who were really favorable to Marcian, probably worked with him in the Senate at one point, praised him for his boldness. But at this time, Attila was gearing up for a major campaign against the West, and when you're storing up that kind of grain and you're amassing that many men, word gets out and spreads over long distances. So it's pretty likely that Marcian already knew that Attila had his sights set elsewhere and wouldn't be able to retaliate for a while. So it's possible that Marcian's plan was to use the money he would save from not paying that subsidy to build an army and maybe challenge Attila later. So this wasn't a completely mindless move or some move that was, really inspired or super bold. It was just one that was made knowing that Attila couldn't do anything about it in the near future. So I think that is a distinction that needs to be made. So how did Marcian become so popular with all of the contemporary historians from the 5th century? Well, pretty simple. He cut their taxes fairly dramatically. So at the time when he came to power, there was a tax called the Fullis. I believe it dates back to Constantine I, which was a tax of 7 pounds of gold on the property of senators. Well, Marcian ends that. So that's 7 pounds of gold each senator gets to keep every single year. He also granted a remission of tax arrears early on, and tax arrears are taxes that you owe from previous years. So that helped quite a few people, not just the super rich, but also a lot of towns and provincial farmers and that kind of stuff. So, that's a pretty easy way to buy popularity early on in your reign. And maybe he was able to afford these by cutting that subsidy to Attila that first year. I don't know. Another thing that he did which made him popular with the senatorial class is that rather than a senator having to marry from a narrow circle of women of senatorial rank, now they're allowed to marry any respectable free woman, meaning any free woman in a trade which is considered respectable. Basically, as long as she's not an actress or prostitute, she's respectable. And that is ultimately a law which will be utilized by Justinian I when he marries Theodora, and also by Justinian's general Belisarius when he marries his wife Antonina. Neither one of those women were from a particularly high social rank. Marcian's domestic policy largely centered upon making the infrastructure of Constantinople better. So he spent a lot of time and money focusing on repairing aqueducts and making other improvements while ending payments to the populace. So a lot of the subsidized or free food and occasional money handouts to the populace were ended. And that's something that would have really endeared him to the senators, who were always bemoaning the mob. The problem is, senators tended to get lots of free things from the state, but they never saw those as a problem. However, if a poor person gets something from the state, then it's apparently a crying shame. I don't know. Not, obviously we have a little bit of that hypocrisy still going on today. Anyway, because Marcian was mostly about saving money, in addition to his relatively conservative ideas of what to spend on for infrastructure, he was able to leave the treasury with reserves, and that would be pretty useful for Leo and Zeno and his successors. Now his reign would be relatively peaceful, and some people would actually view it as a golden age, and keep in mind though, the people who viewed his reign as a golden age were rich men of the senatorial class who gained a lot of wealth because of Marcian being on the throne. Although the details are a bit scanty, it's pretty likely that Marcian was guided through most of his domestic policy, or at least a great deal of it, by his primary advisor, Euphemius, the Master of Offices, who remained with Marcian for the entirety of his 7-year reign. Due to the mostly peaceful nature of Marcian's reign, the best well-known event from that time was actually the Fourth Ecumenical Council in 451. At that council, Marcian and Pulcheria presided in person, which suggests that Pulcheria had a very active hand in government during the first 3 years of Marcion's reign. This council dealt with the issue of Nestorianism once again. We've talked about that before. Look at my Theodosius II video for details. And on the teachings of Eutyches, who was an older gentleman who I believe was coming up with his own sort of spin on Nestorianism. I might be wrong about that. I don't really care. Theology is not my cup of tea. Anyway, this council at first was seen as a success, and it would be upheld for a while, but it would have long-term consequences that could not have possibly been foreseen in 451, and we'll get into those in due time once we get to the Emperor Zeno and the Emperor Anastasius. Under Marcion, the Byzantines didn't engage in any major wars. However, they did fight a couple of minor ones. One of them was in Syria against the Arabs. Not many details are known. Presumably it was an Arab raid that the local governor had to deal with. A more interesting and well-known confrontation occurred in the Upper Nile, where the general named Florus was able to defeat attacks from beyond the frontier and gain some fame. He would never go on to become emperor or really be mentioned again, though, so I guess his fame was a bit fleeting. So if you recall, Marcion provoked Attila early in his reign by cutting off the annual gold subsidy, and Attila didn't do anything for a couple years. So the first few years of Marcion's reign, Attila was occupied fighting the West, and he was not able to overcome the Western Empire, despite the fact that he inflicted quite a bit of damage. In 453, Attila was regrouping, and he was preparing to attack the East once again, possibly because the East has more money, and it would be a much more lucrative campaign. And at some point, he was, over that winter from, I believe it was 452 to 453, he was celebrating a wedding. He was getting married for probably like the 8th time. I'll just throw that number out there. I don't know how many actual weddings he had celebrated. And he presumably had a little too much to drink, and he had a brain aneurysm and died. He was in his 40s or 50s. Anyway, because the circumstances of his death are a little weird, there have been some modern historians who have speculated that Marcion was the ultimate cause of Attila's death and that he had Attila poisoned. However, a lot of people who think that are really overestimating the effectiveness of ancient spies, and they may have seen one too many James Bond movies for their own good. Marcion seems to have achieved basically everything that he accomplished as emperor within his first couple of years, and then the last several years of his reign seem to be a bit more depressing and subdued. So in 453, his platonic wife Pulcheria died at the age of 54 or 55. She died suddenly and for no discernible reason, just like most Theodosian dynasty people did. However, she did make it past the age of 50, so I guess that's kind of impressive, since almost every other Theodosian that I'm aware of didn't really make it. Her death stunned Constantinople, and she was missed by the entire populace. She had been someone who practiced charity and that kind of stuff, so they liked her quite a bit, especially when her husband was not really a big spender. And in her will, she donated all of her belongings to the poor, so I'm sure that that really increased her standing among the city populace that much more. And because of her deeds, and because the Eastern and Western churches were still united at the time, she is a saint in both the Orthodox and Catholic churches today. The year 455 was a rough year for the Western Roman Empire. Valentinian III executed his general Flavius Aetius, the guy who had defeated Attila the Hun in Gaul, and in turn he was murdered by Aetius's partisans in March of 455. This created a leadership void in the West, and it officially ended the Theodosian line in the West. Between June 2nd and June 16th, the Vandals under an elderly King Gaiseric went to Rome and negotiated a bloodless sack of the city, which far exceeded Alaric's sack in 410 in terms of the number of things that were stolen. During this period, even after the extended sack of Rome, Marcion did nothing. He did not intervene in this affair, and he did not retaliate against the Vandals in any way. On January 27th, 457, Marcian died at the age of 65 after returning from a religious pilgrimage. He was then buried at the Church of the Holy Apostles next to his Platonic wife, Pulcheria. And Marcian had been considered a member of the Theodosian dynasty by virtue of marriage, so his death in early 457 marks the official end of the Theodosian dynasty. He did leave behind one daughter named Marcia Euphemia, and she would later marry the Western Emperor Anthemius. Now, I've already stated my opinion of Marcian. I think that he was highly overrated and that his reputation stems almost entirely from the fact that he appeased the rich and the rich went on to write the histories. I would also point out that he got pretty damn lucky when it came to his policy towards Attila, since Attila had an aneurysm and died before he could make Marcian pay for breaking the agreement that his predecessor had made. So anyway, find out what happens next time when the choice of the next emperor falls upon the most prestigious man in the Eastern Empire, Aspar.